Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. So welcome everybody to the Human Anatomy Final Exam Review Workshop. My name is Stacy,
And I'm Armand.
and we are tutors from the College of Health and Sciences Student Success Center. Next slide. So in this final exam review workshop, we're going to talk about 3 key topics. We're going to give a little bit of an introduction to important concepts in studying human anatomy. We'll go over the skeletal system and then the digestive system.
And this workshop will have polling questions and study tips and like questions that we ask you. So feel free to turn on your cameras and you can speak up or type in the chat whenever you want. If you have a question, you could save it and we'll give you guys time to ask questions, or you can just interrupt us whenever and just speak up whenever you want. And a reminder for you guys is your final is on Monday, May 24th. For the BIOL 65 kids, you guys take it at 2:45 p.m. And the BIOL 65O kids, you guys have from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. to take it, but you have 75 minutes to finish it. So moving on. Yeah, to start off, we want to get you guys used to like the polling feature. So we have this icebreaker poll for you guys to answer. I'll put the poll up right now, and if you guys could have one superpower, what would it be? So I launched the poll. All right, most of you guys picked teleport. Just to be honest, I would too. That seems like the best one.
Especially since I commute to school, it'd be easier to teleport. All right, thank you guys for answering that poll. All right, so let's get started. So kind of like an introduction to understanding human anatomy is the definition of anatomy. So anatomy refers to the study of body structure and its function. So before modern medicine, the only way to really study the human body was to cut it open and evaluate it. So the term anatomy means to cut. And so there are different ways that we can examine the human body. 2 main ways are through gross anatomy and microscopic anatomy. And so I have 2 images on the right, and I want you guys to tell me, feel free to unmute or put it in the chat, which image represents gross anatomy and which image represents microscopic anatomy. Feel free to unmute, put it in the chat. You can match like the number to the letter, yeah. So I'm seeing a lot of you guys in the chat are saying that gross anatomy is image A and microscopic anatomy is image B. And that's absolutely correct. So gross anatomy means to be able to evaluate with the naked eye. And as we can see in this example of part of the digestive system, these are what we would see if, let's say, we were in lab and examining a cadaver. But in image number B, this is actually a microscopic image of cardiac muscle. And so we can't see, if we were examining a heart, let's say from a cadaver, we wouldn't be able to see this detail unless we look at it under a microscope. And can somebody tell me, like, what's another word for microscopic anatomy? Like, what's the study called?
Histology.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, it's also called histology. So, well, oftentimes, especially in lab, you guys examine the difference between like gross anatomical structures and histology. Go on to the next slide. So another big concept when learning anatomy that I always like to talk about with students, no matter what subject or what chapter or system that we are discussing or trying to learn, is the hierarchy of living things. So basically, the hierarchy of living things is the order in which an organism is created or built upon. So we'll start with cells. Cells are the simplest form in the body, or the simplest functional unit of the body. And so cells form together to create tissues, which together form organs. Different organs work together to form an organ system, and multiple organ systems are located within an organism. We, as people, as living things, are organisms. So this is the scale of simple to complex. And the reason I wanted to point this out was because no matter what system you're studying, sometimes, especially because anatomy can be really complex and there's a lot of detail to memorize, I personally find it helpful to sometimes take a step back and think, what am I studying in terms of the hierarchy of living things? And I'll give an example. Like if I'm studying the nervous system, it's a really complex system. We've got neurons, nerves, the brain. Sometimes I like to take a step back and think, okay, I'm studying a neuron. What is a neuron? It's a nerve cell. So then I kind of create this picture in my mind that like, okay, it's a cell. It's simpler compared to like other things within the nervous system, like the brain. The brain is an organ. So it just kind of reminds me of the hierarchy of living things and the structure of the human body. We'll go to the next slide. All right. I'll pass it on to Armand. He's going to talk about the skeletal system.
All right, so first thing about the skeleton overview is first is your axial skeleton, which essentially is all of your skeletons that are down towards the midline of your body, so towards the middle. And this includes your skull, your vertebral column, and your thoracic cage. And the other part of your skeleton would be your appendicular skeleton, which consists of everything like your upper and lower limbs and your pelvic girdle. So for the appendicular skeleton, it refers to a lot of your appendages. So everything towards the outside and not towards the midline, because that's where your axis is, or your axial skeletons. And when you are born, you are actually born with 270 bones, but then you end up with 206 as adults. So as you're growing up and as you're aging, your bones start to fuse together. For example, the bones in your skull or your hip bones, those fuse together as you grow older, which in the end leaves you with less bones when you're an adult. So as we can see in this image, all the bones that are towards the middle of the body, towards the midline and the center, which are in blue, consists of your axial skeleton, and all your appendages and all your limbs are your appendicular skeletons. So the first thing we're going to talk about is your cranial bones. These are the bones that enclose the brain. Now, can anybody list out what these bones are in the chat, or you can say it out loud? Does anybody know any of the cranial bones?
Frontal, parietal, temporal, and I don't remember the other one.
That was good. You got, yeah, we're getting there. So in total, they include the frontal, parietal, yes, temporal, occipital, sphenoid, and ethmoid bone. And all these bones in between them are separated by sutures, which are in the brain. And sutures have three different classifications. So your sutures are just these like the thing that forms the edges that connect each of your cranial bones. And the three types of sutures are the serrate sutures, lap sutures, and plain sutures. And you can tell the difference by these images. The serrate suture has a lot more edges and ridges to it, while the lap suture has more of an overlap feature, while plain sutures are more straight, just straight down, not as many ridges and edges as the serrate suture. So now we're taking a look at your skull bones, and I want to go over all of these highlighted structures with you guys so you guys can name them as we go along. So we can start with this blue highlighted structure. Does anybody know which cranial bone this is? The one in blue. Yes, that's correct. The parietal bone. This parietal bone is towards like the top and more back of your head. And you have to remember that there's two of these. One on your towards the right side and one towards the left side. Can anybody name the front, the yellow structure here? I almost gave it away. Yes, that is the frontal bone. You can just think of it, it's like your forehead towards the front of your skull. What about this orange highlighted structure?
Temporal.
Yes. And just like the parietal, you have to remember that there's two of these. They're towards your temples, which are on the side of your head, and there's one on your left and one on your right side. Can anybody name what this green highlighted structure is? Yes, that is occipital, and it is towards the back and bottom portion of your head. Does anyone know what the purple one is? Yes, that is your sphenoid bone. This is kind of a side view of it, but your sphenoid bone goes more towards the middle of your head, and it kind of articulates out to the side as well. And this last red one, does anybody know what it's called? Yes, that's correct, your ethmoid bone. That is at the top of your nasal cavity. And as you can see in this image, we'll go one more with the labels. Your frontal bone, your sphenoid bone, and your ethmoid bone, which are all part of your cranial bones, but they also make up part of your orbital bone, which are also bones that are in your facial bones, and they make up like your eye socket. So in total, you guys remember you have 8 cranial bones with 6 different types of bones. So now I have a polling question for you, true or false. I will send out the poll right now. Remember to read over the question carefully. Yes, perfect. You guys all got it correct. It is false. Does anybody know what is false about that statement right there?
There should be 2 sphenoid bones.
No, not quite. Yes. It says 2 occipital bones, but in reality, there's only 1 occipital bone and 2 parietal bones. So that's the difference. So you always got to make sure to read the questions correctly and make sure that every single bone has, every term has the correct number of bones within them, because they'll try to trick you on the test by putting one term as incorrect. So does anybody have any questions on that? No, we can move on. Next is your vertebral column, which is a chain of 33 vertebrae and intervertebral disc. And the vertebral column is separated into 5 different sections. Does anybody know what those 5 different sections are? What the names of them are? Very good. Yes. It is the cervical vertebrae, which has 7 vertebrae within it, thoracic vertebrae, which has 12, lumbar, which has 5, and then your sacrum, which has 5 as well, and your coccyx, or also known as your tailbone, which ranges about 3 to 4. Sometimes it has 5, but not that often. And your curvature of your vertebral column, you want the normal curvature is an S-shaped. There are some diseases like scoliosis that will push it kind of towards the side. It'll start bending sideways instead of going straight. Or as you get older, aging people, their cervical vertebrae starts to curve at the top and they start hunching over. Or also in pregnant women, a lot of times their lumbar vertebrae starts to curve forward and their stomach is sticking out a little bit more than what you would want. So also a good way to remember how many vertebrae are in each of these sections. I learned it when I took anatomy for the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar. Think of it as like when you would eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner. As you go down the list, so you would eat breakfast at 7 o'clock, and the cervical vertebrae has 7 bones. Thoracic is 12, which is like noontime, and you would eat dinner at 5. So that way, I would be able to remember and differentiate how many bones are in each of these sections. Now also, some of the functions of your vertebral column include it supports the skull and torso because the skull sits right on top of it, on top of the cervical vertebrae, and your torso surrounds the middle of your body where your vertebral column is. It also protects your spinal cord. So these are all your, this is part of your nervous system that runs down your spinal cord and gives you movements to your muscle in your body. And it's very important because if something happens to this, we all know that it could end up in an injured person being paralyzed or partially paralyzed. So it's very important to protect the spinal cord. It also allows movement because of the spinal cord and all the nerves going to your muscles. And it absorbs stress from walking, running, and lifting, which is very big. And it does this through the intervertebral disc, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But this absorbs a lot of the stress that you get from walking, running, or lifting, or doing like everyday activities. It also provides attachment for limbs, the thoracic cage, and your postural muscles. So these limbs, like your appendicular skeletons, your costal muscles, which are the muscles around your rib cage, and these are also your postural muscles that allow you to that support your skull and torso, just like how your vertebral column does, and it allows you to have and maintain good posture as you like go about your everyday tasks. So for the intervertebral disc, we can see here in this image that it sits in between each one of these vertebrae bones, and it consists of an outer layer as well as an inner layer. And it holds the vertebrae together because they're all connected in one. It is a shock absorber for the spine. As I mentioned before, this is where a lot of the pressure is taken off of your bone and your body through the intervertebral disc. Now, as I said before, it has an outer layer and an inner layer. Does anybody know what the inner layer is called? The inner section, you could say. What is the name of it? Yeah, it's a little bit of a trickier one. It is the nucleus pulposus, the nucleus pulposus. And it is the central portion, and it consists of this gelatinous like liquid. It's very water-like, but also slightly gel-like. And this water and gel consistency is where all the shock absorption occurs. So this is what helps you absorb all the shock that is going throughout your spine. Does anybody know what the outer portion is called? The outer ring around it. So the outer portion is called the annulus fibrosus. And it is made up of this strong fibrocartilage that surrounds the inner gelatinous, the middle part. And why you want this to be strong and structured is because if it breaks and the nucleus pulposus starts leaking out, one, that's very painful, and two, that will take away the function of your intervertebral disc, and the shock absorption will be at a much lesser degree if the gelatinous consistency starts leaking out of the middle. So next we can talk about the rib cage. There are 12 pairs of ribs within your rib cage, and they are all attached to the thoracic vertebrae. Now there are two types of ribs. There are your true ribs and your false ribs. Does anybody know, and you can take a look at this image right here, which ribs are your true ribs?
1 through 6.
Almost. It is 1 through 7. Does anybody know why it is 1 through 7? If you try to look at some of the features that ribs 1 through 7 share.
1 through 7 attaches directly to the sternum.
Perfect. Yes, it has an independent cartilage connection directly to the sternum. While your false ribs, which are ribs 8 through 12, they do not have this independent connection. For your ribs 8 through 10, as you can see in the image, they connect onto the cartilage of rib 7. So they're not actually connected directly. They connect to 7, which then connects to the sternum. But then also for your ribs 11 and 12, these are your floating ribs, which have absolutely no attachment, no cartilage attachment to the sternum. So they kind of just sit out there, just kind of floating about without a connection. Does anybody have any questions about the vertebral column or rib cage that we just covered? Moving on. So if you guys don't have any questions, I have a question for you. Which of the following vertebrae sections both consist of 5 vertebrae each? I will launch that right now. So most of you guys got it correct. It is the lumbar and sacrum. Those have 5 each. The reason why it's the reason why it's not the cervical is because not the sacrum and cervical for answer B is because the cervical has 7, not 5. If you think back to the big like the little study tip I had, 7 is more towards like breakfast time, which is at the start of the day, which is the start of the vertebral column. So cervical has 7. And for coccyx and cervical, which was also answered, yeah, the cervical has 7, therefore it can't be the correct answer. So moving on to some of your appendicular bones, you have your radius and ulna. And the difference between them, these are the bones that are in your forearm from your wrist to your elbow. And the radius is lateral if you're looking at a body in anatomical position, and the ulna is medial, more towards the middle and midline of your body. The proximal ends, which is the ends that are closest to your body, they articulate with the elbow. They form the elbow joint, and they touch the humerus, which is your bone of your arm. The distal end articulate and connects with your wrist and the carpal bones that are within your wrist. The head of the radius is proximal, while the head of the ulna is distal. So that's a feature that you guys have to remember if they ask on a test. The head of the radius is proximal, and we will look at that in the next slide. Also, the radius crosses over during pronation. So during supination, if your palm is facing upwards and you turn it over, your radius actually crosses over the ulna, and we'll talk about a little bit more about how and why it does that. So in this image, we can look at some of the features that are within the radius and ulna. At the top of your ulna, you have your olecranon, which articulates with the olecranon fossa that is in the humerus. So it touches that part of the humerus and it forms a joint there. As we can see here, the head of the radius is more towards the top. It is more proximal, while the head of the ulna is more distal and towards the bottom. Some of these distal features as well are the styloid processes of the radius and ulna. And a good way to remember this is the styloid processes, they all kind of have like a little point to them, a little like tip. And styloid means pen. So the way I remembered it is like it kind of looks like the tip of a pen or pencil. Therefore, it's a styloid process. Here we also have the interosseous, I'm not really sure how to pronounce that, membrane, but this membrane is a connective tissue that attaches and connects the radius and ulna together. And this helps keep them in place, as I mentioned before. It also helps when you are rotating your arm and your radius crosses over the ulna. This helps it rotate and cross over, as well as keeps it in position as it comes back and as it moves side to side. And yeah, you also have other features like the neck of your radius, which is under the head of the radius, and your radial and ulnar tuberosity, which are just points of the bones that kind of just stick out a little bit. They have a little bit of an edge and they stick out. So those are your tuberosities. So moving on to your wrist, you have your carpal bones, which are your wrist bones. And there are 2 rows of 4 small bones. You have your proximal row and your distal row. Does anybody know which 4 bones are in your proximal row of your carpal bones? So within the proximal row, you guys have your scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, and pisiform. And I would recommend when you memorize this, memorize it in that order, because when it comes to labeling it within the pictures, that order is going to help you figure out which of the bones is which. So in your distal row, you also have your trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, and hamate. These are the bones that make up the distal row of your carpal bones. And when you're also listing the bones on like a cadaver or a skeleton, you want to list them right to left. I know we usually read left to right, and sometimes I get mixed up by that. But when you want to list them, you want to list them from the right side to the left of your proximal row, and then you go back to the right side to the left of your distal row. And then mnemonic that I learned from the anatomy class that you guys probably heard too is the some lovers try positions that they can't handle. So this is where it comes into when you are memorizing the rows, to memorize them in a specific order. So then you could use this mnemonic as well to help you memorize or help you label all the bones in the correct order. So if we take a look at this image right here, the first bone that you would look for is your scaphoid. It is the first bone of your proximal row. And when I said list them right to left, one thing you have to watch out for is you don't want to go too far to the right, because it can be kind of confusing. It might look like the trapezium is part of the proximal row, but it's not. So you want to make sure that you get the scaphoid. And a way to identify the scaphoid, it is kind of one of the bigger bones of your carpal bones, and it has this triangular or like shark tooth feature to it, or kind of like a hook. So that's a way to identify the scaphoid bone. And then you'd go down from the right to the left, and then back to the right for the distal row, down to the left. And as we move down your hand, we get also to your metacarpals. Your metacarpals are the bones of your palm. So these are from your wrist to your fingers. And the way we label the metacarpals is from your thumb, the bone that is on your thumb side, to your pinky starts at metacarpal 1. So you would label it 1 on your thumb side, and then 2 your index, 3 middle, 4 ring, 5 pinky. So you want to go from your thumb to your pinky. And the phalanges are the bones of your fingers. They have proximal, middle, and distal bones. However, your thumb only has the proximal and distal. So all of your other 4 fingers, they have 3 of the phalange bones, while your thumb only has 2 of them. And in this image, we can also kind of see, going back to the carpal bones, a little better view for you guys to differentiate between the 2 rows. You can see the scaphoid has this shark tooth feature to it. And then the trapezium, which kind of does look like a little bit more on the right side than the scaphoid, but that is the start of the distal row. And as we move down the hand, you have your metacarpals, which are the bones of your palm. And they are labeled 1 through 5 starting at your thumb. And as we get to your phalanges, you can see that your 4 other fingers all have 3 phalanges, while your thumb only has 2. It only has the proximal and distal. So quick fire chat question. Which finger is your phalanx 4? Which one is number 4? You guys can just type it in the chat. Your ring finger. That's correct. Good job. And now a poll. If you guys remembered, or if you guys use the mnemonic to label it, what is the name of the carpal bone labeled with the star? I will send the poll out right now. Good, yes. Most of you guys got it. It is a trapezium. One common mistake that even I fell into is the difference between the trapezium and the trapezoid, because these are the two bones that start with T. So if you're following the mnemonic, they both start with T, and they're both in the distal row, the trapezium and trapezoid. But the way I remembered to remember that the trapezium is actually first before the trapezoid is just by like going by alphabetical order. If you look at the difference between trapezium and trapezoid, I goes before O. So therefore trapezium is first in alphabetical order, and it is first within the distal row. So those are just like some little ways you can play with the words to help you memorize them. And moving on towards the lower part of your body is the pelvic or hip girdle. This consists of 2 hip bones and your sacrum. Does anybody know what the 3 bones of your hip is called? Can anybody name the 3 bones of your hip? So the bones of your hip, they are, oh wait, I missed. All right, so let me talk about this first. There are 2 hip bones are your there are 2 hip bones are your pelvic girdle and also the sacrum. They articulate at the sacroiliac joints and the pubic symphysis. So these are where the joints are formed and connected between the 2 hip bones. You have a false or greater pelvis. Oh, and this is the part of the pelvis that is superior to the pelvic brim. And you also have the true or lesser pelvis, which is inferior to the pelvic brim. The pelvic brim is just that opening, the circle, the start of the circle that is within your pelvic girdle. And whatever is above that opening and circle is your false pelvis, and whatever is below is your true pelvis. And there are also key differences between male and female pelvises. Does anybody know, or can anybody list some of the differences between a male and female pelvis? Yes, very good. Yes. So a male pelvis is more robust. It is more strong and sturdy, but it is also more narrower, and it has a subpubic angle of less than 90 degrees. The subpubic angle is that when the 2 pubic bones connect, they have this little angle that they form underneath them. So for the males, it's less than 90 degrees, and for the female, it's wider and above 90 degrees. Female pelvises are also wider and therefore more adapted to childbirth. So yes, you guys are correct with those feature. Now looking at this image, and I'm sure you guys probably have or will get a question like this. Can anyone identify which is the pelvic girdle of a male and which one is of a female? You can just say like left is whatever and right is whichever. Answer is on the left side is the female and on the right side is the male. So looking at this image, it is kind of difficult, but some features that you can identify is that if you take a look at the sacrum, a lot of times that also shows which one is wider. You can see the sacrum of the female is wider than the one of the male over here. This is one of the things that I looked for whenever I was trying to identify between the two. Yes, the male is also more heart-shaped, yes. And you can also take a look at the subpubic angle. I was talking about this is where the two pubis bones meet and they create this angle underneath them. With the one for the female, you can see it's wider than this one here for the male. So those are some features that I would look for to identify the differences. And now we can talk about the hip bones. These are 3 bones which are eventually fused, and they fuse as we grow up. These bones are your ilium, ischium, and your pubis bones. Some other features on your hip bones is a acetabulum, which is the socket that the head of the femur articulates with. So your femur or thigh bone sits in that socket, and that's where the thigh bone begins. And there's also the obturator foramen, which is a hole within each of your hip bones, and that's where all your blood vessels and nerves pass through so they can go to your legs and the lower portion of your body. So if you look on this image, there are a lot of terms that you guys will need to know on the hip. The ilium is the most superior of the hip bones, and ischium is this green part that's inferior to it, and the pubis bone is more medial. It's more towards the inside of your hip bones. Some features on the ilium are the iliac crest, which is at the top here. You can kind of think of it as like a wave. It goes over the top, or a cap for your hip bones. You also have the different spines, which are these little points that stick out. So you have your anterior superior, anterior inferior, posterior inferior, and posterior superior. And you want to know the differences between them, and especially which one is forward and which one is backwards, because if you're looking at it incorrectly, you might think the posterior superior is the anterior superior, when in reality it isn't, and you might get a question wrong. So know that the anterior superior faces where the pubis is. It faces more towards the middle and front on the side of the pubis bone. Here we also can see your acetabulum. That's where, as I talked about, the head of the femur articulates with. You have other ones like the ischial spine. There's only one of them instead of 4 like you had on the ilium. You also have the ramus of the ischium. Ramus just means like arm or branch. You kind of see it branches out, and it touches the inferior ramus of the pubis, which also has the superior ramus, which is on top. And other features are like the greater sciatic notch. You can differentiate this between the lesser one just based on size, or you can also think greater is above. It is this one is above the lesser one, so it is the greater sciatic notch. And the location of the pubic symphysis. The pubic symphysis is just the where the connection between the two pubis bones are, and it is connected by that small cartilage of connective tissue that just connects them together and holds them in place together. Does anybody have any questions about the hips or any of the pelvic girdle? Okay, so now we can talk about the knee, which is also known as a tibiofemoral joint because it attaches the tibia to your femur. It is a hinged synovial joint. Hinge meaning it can only mostly do flexion and extension, and it has little side mobility. So your knee can bend like up and down, flex and extend a good amount, but when it comes to rotating it or moving it towards the sides, it's not as good and it doesn't move as far. Synovial means that it has the synovial sacs, these little sacs of water that is within your joints, and it provides so that there's less friction, so your bones don't just grind up against each other, and it sits in between them so that there is less friction and less tension as you're moving your skeleton and your body. Some of the ligaments and features that the knee contains is your patella. This is your kneecap. It is on the front of your knee, and attached to this is the patellar ligament, which attaches the patella to the tibia underneath it. There are also your lateral and medial menisci, which just sit flat inside the knee and provide or serve as like almost a cushion. You have your anterior cruciate ligament and your posterior cruciate ligament. These are the ones in the front and back of your knee, and cruciate means it crosses. So these ligaments cross each other and they kind of form an X. So they go across the knee. And then you also have your medial and lateral collateral ligaments. Collateral is straight. Think of it, you can think of it as like parallel or like a ladder. It goes straight up and down. So those are on the outside and the inside of your knee. And we can see here in this image, through this anterior view, you guys have your patellar ligament, which would be connected to the patella, but that is taken out to show the inside. So you can see that how that connects to your tibia. And then you can see your ACLs, or your lateral and medial menisci. More in this posterior view, they sit right in between, in the middle of the knee, and kind of serve as a little padding and protection for your knee. There's your ACL and PCL, which you can see here in this anterior and posterior view. You can see here in the front, the ACL, it goes across, it has a cross direction, while the posterior forms that X in the back, and that goes across in the back part of your knee. And there also is the MCL and the LCL, which is in the medial side, which connects to the tibia. And you have to remember the lateral collateral ligament connects to the fibula, not the tibia, because it is on the outside, and the fibula is also on the outside. And they go straight down, they do not cross anything. So now a question about going back to the hip. True or false? The ischium is superior to the ilium. Let me put that poll out right now. Good, you guys, most of you guys got it right. It is false. One way I used to remember which one is like in which position is I go back to, I look at the word and try to find something within like the actual word and letters that can help me remember. And the way I remember this, to remember that the ilium is superior, is that ilium is also first in alphabetical order before ischium. So therefore it is first and on top. That's how I remember it. So it would be on top, and ischium is in the is underneath it, inferior to it. And another polling question, what does MCL stand for? Let me put that up for you right now. So yeah, it is very important to like know the terms and the definitions and exactly where these features are, or where on your body these things are. So it is D, medial collateral ligament. For those that put B, the difference between that, can anybody tell me why it wouldn't be B? Does anybody know why it's not B? Okay. Well, the reason why it isn't B is because B is medial cruciate. Yes, correct. Cruciate means cross. only the ACL, the anterior cruciate ligament, and the PCL, the posterior cruciate ligaments, those are the only ones that cross. The MCL and the LCL, those are collateral, means they go straight down and are almost like parallel to each other. So that's the difference. Cruciate means cross, which is only your PCL and ACL, and collateral means like going straight, which is your MCL and LCL. Very good. So now talking about your ankle. Your ankle are your tarsal bones. These are the bones within your ankle. And instead of rows like you have in your wrist, you have groups. You have 2 groups of 7 bones in total. But you also have a proximal and a distal group. Can anybody name what is in the which bones are in the proximal group of your tarsal bones? Yeah, it is a little difficult to remember, but for your proximal group, it consists of your talus, your calcaneus, and your navicular, those 3 bones, while your distal group has the medial cuneiform, intermediate cuneiform, lateral cuneiform, and your cuboid. And when you're listing the distal group, you want to go from medial to lateral, which we'll also see in the image, but remember to always go medial to lateral when listing the distal group. And a mnemonic, like the one we had for the carpal bones, for this one would be tiger cubs need milk. So it would be talus, calcaneus, navicular. Always remember it in that order. The order is very important. And then milk with a C, it has medial, intermediate, lateral cuneiform. And then the last one is cuboid. So as we can see here in this image, your talus is the first bone of your proximal group. And this bone is the bone that articulates with the tibia. So your tibia is touching this talus bone right here. Your calcaneus bone is the bone of your heel on the bottom and back of your foot, the calcaneus one. And then you have your navicular one, which is a little bit in front and a little bit lower than the talus. So now we get to your distal group. And as I mentioned before, you want to list it from medial to lateral, from the middle to the outside. So it starts with medial cuneiform and intermediate and lateral. And then last one is cuboid. You also don't want to make the mistake of saying that the lateral cuneiform is on the most outside, because it isn't. You always want to remember, if you start it from the most middle, and then you list your way through, that it is not going to actually be on the most outer. It's not the most outer bone, and your cuboid is actually the most outer bone of your foot. Of your ankle. So moving on to your foot, just like how you had your metacarpals, you have your metatarsals. Instead of being the bones of your palm, these are the bones of your sole. So these go from your ankle bones all the way to your phalanges, which are the bones of your toes. So just like in your hand, the numbering system goes from your big toe to your pinky toe, kind of like how it goes from your thumb to your pinky. So it just goes numbers 1 through 5. And just like in your hand as well, for your phalanges, your big toe only has two phalanges, the proximal and the distal, while the rest of your toes have 3 of them. It has the proximal, middle, and distal. So always remember that differentiation between like your thumb and your big toe. It only has 2 phalanges. Does anybody have any questions overall about the foot or the ankle or the knee, any of the appendicular skeletons that we just covered? No, so we'll move on to digestive system.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the digestive system. And first, I want to go over digestive system structure. So the digestive system is kind of broken up into 2 main components, the alimentary canal and the accessory organs. So the alimentary canal is kind of also known as the pathway of food. So it's the organs that food comes in contact with, and it's this tube from our mouth to our anus and all the organs that exist in between. The accessory organs are the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. The next slide. So some digestive system functions include the ingestion of food, also known as intake, the digestion of such food, and then once food is digested, there is an absorption of nutrients into the bloodstream. Can somebody tell me, feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat, why would nutrients be absorbed into our bloodstream? What does our bloodstream then do with nutrients that have been absorbed? Feel free to unmute, put it in the chat.
Does it use the nutrients for energy?
Yeah, so you're on the right track. So eventually, yes, these nutrients are going to be used by other parts of our body to help us be healthy, help us live. And so, yeah, I'm seeing in the chat, send it to the other cells, distribute the nutrients. Absolutely. So the cardiovascular system is a transport system. Blood is a transport. So when food is when we take in food, our body breaks down that food, otherwise known as digestion, and then the nutrients are then absorbed. The bloodstream can then take those nutrients and deliver it to where our body needs it. After that occurs, compaction of waste, or like the formation of waste and the absorption of water is also going to occur. And then the defecation of feces, defecation of waste is also going to occur. And so what's interesting about these functions of the digestive system is that they correspond pretty well to specific organs. And so we're going to see later kind of what that looks like. But before we move on, let's see if we can identify these together. So feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat. We'll go over this in detail on the next few slides when we can see some images, but kind of to test your knowledge, what organs within the digestive system are responsible for these functions? Let's start with ingestion of food. Where do we intake food? The mouth, absolutely. So I'm gonna type in as you guys share. So we have the mouth, absolutely. And then what about digestion of food? Which organs are responsible for digestion of food? Organs in the digestive system help with digestion. Yeah, we have the stomach, the small intestine. I'm going to abbreviate that as SI. The small intestine. And so I'm seeing also in the chat esophagus and large intestine. And so those two organs actually do not digest food. So the esophagus is the only responsibility, or the function of the esophagus is to take food that was in the mouth and to deliver it to the stomach so that it can be digested. And then the small intestine is going to finish that digestion, and actually absorption of nutrients is going to start in the small intestine. But the large intestine, otherwise known as the colon, actually has no digestive properties. It's actually responsible for creating waste and absorbing water. And then also the ends of the colon, like the rectum and the anus, are responsible for the release of our waste. So that's actually, I see that really common. And actually, when I first took the class, I would always get confused too between like small intestine versus large intestine and trying to understand like the purpose of the esophagus. So that's a key thing that I want you all to note. So I see a question in the chat. So would esophagus be ingestion of food or just not part of the digestive system functions? So it is part of digestive system functions. However, think about it as like it's a transport. It's a transportation tube. It's sending food from the mouth to the stomach. That's the only way food can get to our stomach. When we put it in our mouth and we chew it and we break it down, how is it going to get to our stomach? We need to swallow it, and the esophagus then delivers it. Would it be considered part of the alimentary canal? Yes. So it's part of that tube. So from the mouth to the anus, the esophagus is definitely included. And we're actually going to look at a picture next. So we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so in this picture, we kind of reviewed part of the organs of the alimentary canal. We reviewed some accessory organs. And so from what you all understand about the difference between the alimentary canal and the accessory organs, I want to ask you all, or it's a true and false question. So the image that you see on the right, is this image displaying the alimentary canal only? Is it true or false? We'll go ahead and launch that poll. If you can launch that, Armand. Give you guys about like 20 seconds. About 10 more seconds. Okay, go ahead and release the answer. So go to the next slide. So the answer is false. So this image is not only displaying the alimentary canal, and I will explain that. So here we see a few organs and we can list them out. So we have the mouth, I'll just put M for mouth. We have the esophagus. We have the stomach. We have the small intestine. And then we have the large intestine. And so we can see that there are, and then right here, the rectum and the anus. So these organs that I have listed out, these are representing the alimentary canal, the pathway of food. But we see some other organs here. Can someone name the other organs that we see here? I'll add a line. Yeah, so the liver, which is this structure right here, the gallbladder, which is this green structure, and there's one more. It's kind of hidden. Yes, the pancreas. It's kind of hidden down here, this little yellow structure. So these three organs, the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas, yes, they're part of the digestive system. They have a key role in digestion, aiding in digestion, but they're not part of the alimentary canal. And I noticed also in the chat, the salivary glands. So the salivary glands are located in the mouth. So they're not necessarily considered an accessory organ when we're like specifically studying the accessory organs. They are located in the mouth. So let me clear that. Okay, we'll go on to the next slide. So any questions between like the difference between the alimentary canal and the accessory organs before we move on?
Are the accessory organs just the gallbladder, liver, and pancreas?
For this class, my understanding is yes. I would say that it depends on like how in depth you're studying like different parts. So to shortly answer your question, yes, those are the accessory. Those are the three accessory organs. But sometimes when you're studying, like you might want to make note that like there's certain ducts that are involved, like the common bile duct, which is part of the gallbladder, or like ducts that connect like the liver to the gallbladder. But as far as organs themselves, yes, those are the accessory organs.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so let's talk about the alimentary canal or the pathway of food. So as we talked about earlier, food enters our mouth. It is then going to go down our esophagus. Before that, it's going to hit the pharynx, otherwise known as our throat. And there's different parts of the pharynx that we'll look at in a minute. But once it hits our pharynx, travels down our esophagus, it's going to go into our stomach. It's going to then go into our small intestine, then our large intestine, which is also called our colon. Those two words are synonyms, our rectum, and then our anus. So that is the order in which food has traveled. Go to the next slide. So let's kind of dive into each part of the alimentary canal or the pathway of food. So what is involved when food enters our mouth. So our teeth. Our teeth are responsible for mastication, otherwise known as chewing. And so it's going to break down food. And so what kind of like breakdown would that be? And what I'm looking for is you learn a lot about in the digestive system, like mechanical breakdown versus chemical breakdown. What kind of breakdown would mastication be?
Mechanical.
Yes, absolutely. So there is no like chemical breakdown, chemical compositions changing. It's kind of like if you guys have taken chemistry, like a physical change versus a chemical change. We're just breaking apart the food. So that would be the teeth. For the tongue, so the tongue has some muscles that work to help mix food with saliva. So when we're mixing saliva with food, think about what saliva does. What kind of breakdown would that be? Would be a mechanical or a chemical breakdown?
Chemical.
Chemical, absolutely. And so the key thing here is like really understanding the function of saliva. And we'll talk about that when we review the salivary glands. So the salivary glands are exocrine glands, which means that they release whatever they produce into ducts. And so they produce saliva, and then saliva will travel via ducts into the mouth. And these are the three main salivary glands listed here. And so saliva actually helps start digestion. So digestion actually starts in the mouth. So since you guys asked this a lot in the chat, just to kind of recap, when we eat food, when we intake food and we put food in our mouth and we chew it and it mixes with saliva, digestion actually has already started. As it travels down our pharynx, our esophagus, there's no digestion. That's just the simple like travel of the food. And then when it hits our stomach, that digestion is going to continue. We'll go on to the next slide. So after it's in the mouth, I talked about the pharynx. So there's actually three parts of the pharynx. There's the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. I don't have the nasopharynx included here because it's not involved with food. It's more involved if we were studying like the respiratory system because it's located within our nasal cavity. But if we're eating food with our mouth, then the food would pass through the oropharynx, laryngopharynx, and that's when we really experience like the swallowing of the food, which is controlled by the medulla oblongata, which is a structure in our brainstem. Then it goes down the esophagus and then goes into our stomach. And I noted that like the oropharynx and laryngopharynx are we studied a lot when we studied digestive system, but the nasopharynx is more like for respiratory system. A key point that I want to point out is when you're studying the organs of the digestive system, that the esophagus is posterior to the trachea. The trachea is in front, the esophagus is in the back. And so you might have heard like the common phrase like, oh, like my water went down the wrong pipe. Sometimes it's kind of this little malfunction with your epiglottis where like water might come into the trachea. And that's why we cough it up. But the esophagus is posterior and that's where food and drink is supposed to go. So go to the next slide. So we'll talk about the stomach. So when we talked about like the introduction to human anatomy, we talked about like gross anatomy versus microscopic anatomy. So this image shows like a gross picture of the stomach, and we can see certain parts of it. And then microscopic anatomy, if we were to examine stomach cells under a microscope, and like we studied the functions of it, there's some key functions within the stomach that we should note. So the parietal cells secrete hydrochloric acid and the chief cells secrete pepsinogen. And these actions help to start or continue and promote digestion. The mucosal cells secrete mucus, and mucus is for protection. Are there any questions about the stomach before we move on? No? Okay, we'll go to the next slide. So I have a polling question for all of you, and Armand, I'll have you release it. So what's the point of the mucosal cells secreting mucus? Think about the other cells that are involved in the stomach. Think about what they secrete. Why is mucus being secreted? What's the point? Maybe about 10 more seconds. 5 more seconds. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. We'll talk about the answer. So it's to protect the stomach from the acidic environment. So how does the stomach become acidic? So as we talked about earlier, the parietal cells. So the parietal cells are cells that are located within the stomach, and they secrete hydrochloric acid. And the reason why hydrochloric acid is secreted is to actually help digest proteins. Protein digestion thrives in an acidic environment. But the alternative with that is that if the stomach's really acidic, it can actually be harmful to the stomach tissue and the stomach lining. So to combat that, the mucosal cells will secrete mucus to protect the stomach lining. We'll go to the next slide. So now that the food has reached the stomach, it is now entering the small intestine. And so the small intestine continues digestion, it starts absorption. When we think about the accessory organs like the liver and the pancreas, substances like bile, which is formed in the liver, pancreatic juice, which is formed in the pancreas, they're actually going to enter the small intestine and they're going to help with digestion. So once digestion's over, once absorption is over, it's going to then, the content, once it's done traveling through the small intestine, it's going to enter the large intestine or the colon. So the small intestine is actually broken up into 3 parts. Can somebody name me the 3 parts? We'll start with the first part. What is the first part of the small intestine called?
Jejunum.
Close. It's a different word. I'm seeing in the chat duodenum. Yeah, that's the answer. So the duodenum is the first part of the small intestine. So it's where like a lot of other contents like bile, pancreatic juice, other enzymes are going to be present to digest food. So what would the second part of the small intestine be? Like the middle of the small intestine? Yeah, the jejunum. And then the last part of the small intestine that's connected to the colon is the ileum, absolutely. And so a way that I like to remember this is that the connection between the small intestine and large intestine, there's this valve called the ileocecal valve, because the cecum is the first part of the colon. That helps me remember that the last portion of the small intestine is known as the ileum. So thank you guys for answering that. We'll go to the next slide. So I have a polling question. So let's talk about bile for a minute. So bile is secreted into the small intestine and it aids in the digestion of food. I want you to tell me, what organ is bile released from and what is that organ in respect to the digestive system? Give you guys about 30 seconds. Okay, so we'll go ahead and go over the answer. So it's the gallbladder and the accessory organ. So as I talked about earlier, the liver is what creates bile, and then it's going to store it in the gallbladder. And so when bile is stored in the gallbladder, whenever we eat a meal, especially one that's like high in fat contents, once this partially digested food has reached our small intestine, specifically the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine, the gallbladder is then going to release that bile to help aid in to help digest that food. And so as we talked about earlier, this would be an accessory organ. It's not part of the alimentary canal. It's not part of this like mouth to anus tube. It's not the liver or the gallbladder, because we're talking about the gallbladder, is not coming in contact with the food, but it plays a big role in the digestive system because it's going to then release that bile, which is going to go into the small intestine and help digest food. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide. So after food has been digested, nutrients are starting to be absorbed in the small intestine, we're going to reach the colon, otherwise known as the large intestine. So content is going to travel through the ileocecal valve and it's going to enter the cecum. And so here in this list, I have the parts of the colon, the large intestine. So food is going to travel up the ascending colon. It's going to take a turn at the right colic, otherwise known as the hepatic flexure. It's going to travel horizontally across the transverse colon. It's going to take a turn at the left colic, otherwise known as the splenic flexure. It's going to travel down the descending colon, down the sigmoid colon, and then it'll reach the rectum and anus, and then we will then excrete that waste. So as I mentioned earlier, the large intestine does not have any digestive properties. Their digestion at this point is over. And so now what the colon wants to do is absorb water and create waste. So that's what's going on here. So before we move on, I want to ask you all specifically a question about the right colic hepatic flexure and the left colic splenic flexure. Why do you think that the right colic flexure is also called the hepatic flexure? And why do you think the left colic flexure is also called the splenic flexure? Why are those like the alternative names?
I think the left colic flexure is also called the splenic flexure because it's near the spleen.
Yes, absolutely. And then I see in the chat, the right hepatic flexure is near the liver. Yeah, so hepatic pertains, that word hepatic or like hepatology is the study of the liver. So absolutely right. So it's the right colic or like the right side of the colon is by the liver because the liver is on the right side of the abdomen. And then the left colic flexure is by the spleen and the spleen is on the left side of the abdomen. Absolutely. So are there any questions on specifically anything about the colon or anything that we've covered about the digestive system?
On that exam, will we be tested on, will we have to know the right colic or left colic, or will we have to know the hepatic or splenic flexure?
That I don't know. I don't really have any information on like what the exam is on, but I don't think it would hurt to learn both. When I studied for this class, I would write down both names just to remind myself that it's the same thing, right? It's that turn between like the ascending colon and the transverse colon, or the transverse colon and the descending colon. They're the same thing, but I would write down both names just to remind myself.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. And I see in the question here, what is the common bile duct? So we talked a little bit about it in terms of like bile and how it goes from the liver to then the gallbladder to then the small intestine. So when bile is stored in the gallbladder, it's going to enter the small intestine through the common bile duct. And I see someone comment in the chat, the common bile duct is the connection between the liver and the gallbladder. Yes. Any more questions? All right, I'll pass it on to Armand and he's going to go over some study tips.
Yes, so here are some of the study tips that have helped me succeed in the Bio 65 class. To start off specifically with the lectures, because a lot of your lectures and your lecture tests, they are tests about a lot of the terms, and it's more word-based and about all the definitions. So a good way to memorize this is to use flashcards. You could put a term and like a muscle or something and say what its function is or like what it does. You put the term on one side and the definition on the other, and just go over and over again. The more you do it, the more you'll remember. And using flashcards for me was the most effective way to study for the lecture. Now for the lab, since the lab tests are almost like all pretty much images where you would have to label certain body parts or features. I found this website that I used last year called purposegames.com. You guys can go to it afterwards, but essentially this website has pretty much almost any anatomical like feature that you can think of. It has your brains, your heart, your skeletons, your skin, your cells. You can just search it up and it'll give you these little tests or quizzes that are created by other people where you would have to match the term with the specific like bullet point that is on the image within the quiz. So like if you were talking about the skeleton, it would say the word like humerus, and then you would have to click on the bullet point that is on the humerus to get it correctly. So this way, if you do it over and over again, it is the game is it is a website called purposegames.com, and within that website you have a bunch of these little games. And it also isn't just anatomy. There's like all other subjects. Before anatomy, there is also like all these other body parts that you can look up. But essentially, yeah, it would give you the name of the term, and then you match that term to whatever bullet point is on the specific body part. And you just have to do it over and over again and think of it more like a game. That's how I did it. After a while, it kind of doesn't feel like studying because it kind of is a game. And then you just go through it over and over again, and then like by the next day you will remember it a lot better just by playing this game over and over. Repetitions, to be honest, is also another key to studying. You repeatedly go over your flashcards or repeatedly go over these games in order to help you memorize. And also, one thing overall, when you study, you want to plan out your study sessions. You don't want to overload yourself all in one day. I would typically take about a week up until the exam and leave the last day before the exam to kind of go over everything. But so for the week before that, I would study day by day, section by section up until the test day. So you plan it out and you do little by little so you don't overload yourself too much at one time. And this study tip is also, this flyer is in your Canvas. I'm pretty sure Marcos posted it, so you can also take a look at this there. And there's also, if you guys saw in the chat, we will have a survey, a feedback survey for you guys to fill out. If you fill out the feedback survey, we will send you this PDF of all the slides that we provided today, and we'll send you the answers to the polling questions that we have, as well as also there is a YouTube link that was posted. And if you guys click on the link sometime later today or possibly tomorrow, this workshop recording will be posted up on the YouTube link. So if you guys want to go over it, or for anyone that missed this workshop, they can go there and watch it again. So overall, if you guys have any extra questions, feel free to ask, and we will be here to answer any of your questions that you guys have.
You said that if we complete the survey, we'll be sent a link to this recording, correct?
Yes. No, you guys will be sent a link to the YouTube channel, which this recording will be posted on, and then we'll also send it directly to your email. This all the slides that we just went over today, as well as an answer sheet to the polling questions.
Thank you.
Any chance you can go over the orbit of the eye bones? I did not include it in this workshop, but we can talk about it, yes. So are there going to be any more workshops? No, this is the last workshop of this year. There will be workshops next semester, but for this year, this is the last one. So Yeah, thank you guys for coming too. We really appreciate your participation today.
Yes, thank you all. And to remind all of you, the link to the YouTube channel was posted in the chat, as well as the survey. And for those of you who filled out the survey, we'll send you a PDF of these slides. And we'll include like any slides that were like fill in the blank. I'll go in and I'll put the answers in so that you guys have those as well.